Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you here this week. Unfortunately, I wasn't available last week due to illness, but I'm hoping my throat lasts the duration of the 3 hours. I still have a little bit of an infection, but big welcome to all of you today to the introduction to Housing First. And I suppose my understanding is some of you have some experience of Housing First. Some of you work with housing or homeless agencies already. Some of you might be students. But we may have a mix here. So the introduction to Housing First, I break it up into 4 sections. The learning outcomes will be basic but important in the context of what is Housing First, why Housing First, and who do we prioritize for Housing First. And following this, we look at in section 2, we look at, I suppose, the staircase model and the importance of fidelity to Housing First. And in section 3, we will look at the principles of Housing First, the culture, the practices. And in the concluding part, section 4, we look at, again, the learning outcomes, why Housing First, what is Housing First, and who participates in Housing First. And more importantly, does housing work first? So I suppose before I share the screen, so what is Housing First? Well, Housing First is an evidence-based strategic framework to house long-term homeless people, rough sleepers, service participants with complex multiple needs exclusions, ranging from addiction, mental health, maybe all of the above, adverse childhood experiences, in an integrated way with the health systems in our countries, aligned with the NGOs being the homeless organizations and with the local authorities or the municipals or councils in a wraparound fashion with these support services. There is, I suppose, different approaches to Housing First. The predominant one we're looking at is the pathways model, which we come onto here, which originated in New York in 1992 under the tutelage of Dr. Sam Decemberis, and also, I suppose, the Finnish model, which has been very successful here. I suppose there's 2 great differences in Europe, 2 great differences there in terms of the pathways model focusing on scattered site approach and the Finnish model, which has been nearly completely successful, I suppose, but it looks at the more congregated approach. So, and why Housing First? We'll come on to that in the context of the staircase model and the differences between the Housing First approach and the staircase model. I would reiterate here as well, as we don't have breakout rooms today, that please feel free to ask questions at any time at all. We'll keep it as informal and as participatory as possible. And I think it will be very useful. So in that context, the first section will be about 45 minutes. You might take a 10-minute break. Section that's on, so it's the overview and the background to Housing First. And I'm sure my voice won't hold out for the 3 hours, so I'll need to listen to you as well. And the second section, we look at the staircase model and the importance of fidelity, which means faithfulness to the core principles. And we should cover that in about half an hour, maybe take a 5-minute break. And then the principles, the culture, the practice, putting those principles into practice will take about 45 minutes. And maybe a 10-minute break in the concluding then for maybe a half an hour. I think that's about 3 hours. We look at again, what is Housing First? Why Housing First? Who is it for? And does it work? So, as I said, please come in at any stage to ask the question. So there's the schedule. I think I just outlined that. Again, those ground rules in the context of it, respectful communication, which we all know, the teaching methods, which is PowerPoint presentation, the breaks, I just outlined, and questions and feedback. Questions anytime, please. Can we cover the background? I just mentioned it there. The learning outcomes, section 2. I think I just covered that. Section 3, the principles. Section 4, conclusion, learning outcomes, etc. So as I'm aware, you have a mixed experience and knowledge of Housing First. So this is an introduction for beginners. But we can probe some of the important aspects and facets of Housing First throughout this. So I'm sure most of you know this already, but it emerged in the 1990s in New York as an alternative to existing systems of addressing chronic homelessness and mental health and substance misuse issues. So that Pathways model, as we said, originated from Sam Decemberis in New York in the 90s, and it's an evidence-based approach. We have been, I suppose, in Ireland, I suppose I should have given you a background to myself in the context of it. We have been trying housing first since about 2013 in Cork without that integrated approach, without the wraparound support services, but just, I suppose, trying to align ourselves with the principles and the philosophy. Again, it doesn't work in the context of without that integrated approach with the relationship with the stakeholders, the health systems, the local authorities, the municipals, and the NGOs. But obviously in 2018, the National Irish Implementation Plan, I suppose, put it on a statutory footing, and we've been up and running since then. So in terms of my role or my background, I would have, I suppose, academic background would be in social science. We've done a social science degree back in the early 90s. Now you have my age, and a master's just following that, I suppose, the mid 90s in social science. I lecture part-time in social studies in University College Cork. For the last 20 years or thereabouts, I worked full-time with the homeless services in Cork City with Cork Simon. The first 10 years, I've been service leader in the emergency accommodation, emergency homeless services, and the last 10 years in housing. And I suppose my role now would be as head of Housing First, rapid rehousing and tenancy support in the southwest region of Ireland. That's Cork City, County Cork, and County Kerry. So in the context of the background, emerged in the 1990s in New York as an alternative to existing systems for addressing chronic homelessness and mental health and substance issues. I think many of us who are working in the homeless sector will have seen these long-term issues of, I suppose, comparing the staircase model, the traditional model, which is complementary to Housing First as well because of the local knowledge and local expertise as well. But I suppose the reality is in the staircase model, there was the steps in terms of roughly being homeless, emergency accommodation, transitional housing, housing ready, must be compliant with treatment models in the context of mental health and in the context of addiction before being housed. The Housing First approach in the context is straight from streets really to permanent housing with integrated supports, permanent housing and to provide sustainable exits from homelessness. And the Pathways Housing, as we said, designed a model of service established as an evidence-based. The Pathways Housing model has been replicated in contexts including Canada, Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, Australia, Japan. It's been updated from that, Ireland, Scotland, Finland. It's all pretty much happening in the last decade and the last few years, in particular in our context. The consistent housing retention rate outcomes of 85%. It's strong evidence base, so it varies between 75% and 95% of success rate. Outcomes strongly linked to fidelity to the principles and practices of the Housing First model. We come on to fidelity and the importance of it and its faithfulness to the core principles of Housing First in the next section. Although we mentioned the Finnish model, which has been very successful on the Y Foundation there. So Housing First, an overview of background. Housing First is an internationally recognized evidence-based solution for people who sleep rough and long-term users of emergency accommodation with complex needs. Housing First successfully engages with these individuals by offering and providing immediate access to a home of their own, as well as access to person-centered, community-based and recovery-oriented supports. So there, that's critical to some of the principles already if we're looking at person-centered, community-based, and recovery-oriented supports. So in the context of the model we use in the southwest region of Ireland, it's really about bringing the services to their apartment, to their home. We have, I suppose, a hybrid system in Cork City, Cork County, and County Kerry, but we have a hub in the southwest region where it's a multidisciplinary team based, I suppose, in the standalone model. We're quite fortunate with some of the skills and expertise we have, but in the context of our case managers, occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, and clinical nurse managers, very much focused on bringing it adapting it to meet people's needs where they're at, and bringing the services into their homes really predominantly. Obviously, there's a strong focus on integrating our service participants and tenants into the wider community. And again, I suppose the community integration model or the shared care model would be predominantly with combined of case managers would have a very strong focus on community integration. Some of the challenges, I suppose, we would have come across to date, I suppose, obviously, is property, houses, I suppose, dealing with landlords in terms of antisocial behaviour, the regional aspect, the rural aspect in terms of covering wide areas, which we have in County Kerry, and the real, I think, focus now is in terms of the qualitative pieces and the social integration and community participation and the qualitative sense of our service participants and tenants, because it certainly works as well proving to house people permanently, to successfully sustain their exits from homelessness, provide quality homes, quality services, and again, without preconditions in the context of regardless of compliance with treatment for taking compliant medication compliant in terms of mental health or in terms of addiction. Obviously, well, experiential wise, the best place to work with people is in a home. It's nearly impossible to work with people in emergency accommodation or on the streets, or for them to have any real hope of dealing with their issues in these conditions. So the home is the starting point, and it is wraparound supports. It is extensive. It is hard work. You do need the right people. We'll come on to that in terms of the principles, the core values, and the culture of housing first. So this includes the provision of permanent, secure housing to people sleeping rough in homeless accommodation without any preconditions around sobriety or housing readiness. It also includes the delivery of time unlimited as long as a tenant needs visiting support and health supports. So there is evidence that our service participants or tenants over longitudinal studies that the level of complex needs or support needs would reduce over a period of time, normally of estimates 10% after year one. It's not always the case, and particularly in our context in Cork City, where we, in terms of our, say, who is it for and prioritization, we would use as part of the National Implementation Plan, the Venn diagram in the context of overlapping the three areas of long-term homeless, rough sleeping, frequency of use in emergency departments or psychiatric units, and combine that with the local knowledge of the homeless agencies and the medical teams, the homeless integrated teams, combining all the information together. When somebody meets the three sections in the Venn diagram, they're prioritized first. We have other properties we get out to two, etc. So within that, we did get a cohort of service participants who had not just the complex needs of addiction, mental health, dual diagnosed mental health issues, adverse childhood experiences, neglect, abandonment, parents with addiction issues or experience of foster care, child sexual abuse. But I suppose as adults, some of our cohort, quite a high percentage, would have had incontinence issues, would have had acquired brain injuries, seizures, alcohol-induced seizures, and mobility issues. So finding homes, ground floors, etc., was an issue. With the level of calls, the wraparound support was quite intense, is intense, particularly during COVID. Notwithstanding that, and we are in a very, very peculiar landscape in the context of epidemiological. There was COVID, technological, which were lecture facilitating training online now, economic, ecological even. So it's a very, and combined in all that, I suppose, with the level of needs that some of our service participants, tenants needed or supports was quite intense. And the reality is the level of need with chronic illness may never reduce. So it's kind of that acceptance as well. So the continued support for as long as required or as long as is needed, depending on the tenant. But it is amazing to see some of them with all these complex issues sustain and I suppose in a qualitative sense, being happy and sustaining their exit from homelessness. Housing First provides a comprehensive and holistic approach to addressing homelessness for people experiencing mental health, physical health, substance misuse, social behaviour, and other challenges. The program consists of three major components. I mentioned already some of the complexities that are not mentioned there in terms of acquired brain injuries or mobility issues or incontinence issues, which makes it even more challenging. But the important aspects of it, housing first, is it provides a permanent, affordable housing. Again, in different jurisdictions, different countries, different regions, what is affordable housing? You know, we're lucky enough here in Ireland, in the context is relatively a standard. There's roughly about a sixth of their income, of their social welfare. And in that context, most of our housing, through Housing First, 50% comes through the local authorities, that is the councils or the municipalities, and 50% then from the NGOs, which we can draw down funds through the capital assist scheme. We have very little emphasis on rentals, which does eliminate some of the experiences or we might feel with landlords when we are, I suppose, landlords ourselves. But as you know, or we find out, to go along, there was important separation between housing and property and support services and treatment. So permanent affordable housing, mobile case managers, just detached case managers, and treatment services, mental health and addiction services. So that there's varying composition of the teams in terms of some standalone teams could have a psychiatrist. I mentioned in our teams in Cork, we have a clinical psychologist, which is quite amazing in some levels to see bringing the, I suppose, psychology to the streets as such area, you know, where there's no clinic, totally providing the rest of the team with a psychologically informed approach to Housing First, and meeting service participants in their apartments, practically on the street sometimes, and advice and signposts and information that we get alongside the service participants or my colleagues or teams get is phenomenal. And it's really, really an eye-opener on a learning curve to see that in action. Likewise with occupational therapists, it's just, it's hard to believe we worked not collectively in the past when you see the value it add on. Likewise, again, clinical nurse specialists or clinical nurse managers, it's just a learning curve. Combine that with the right people in terms of key workers, project workers, and case managers, it really does work. So it's a program philosophy based on client choice and recovery. As we know for Housing First, this is really, really a significant value or principle, which we'll come on to later. I think we all know, for those who have worked in the homeless services, whether it's Housing First or not, that if a service participant doesn't choose something, it doesn't work, you know, preconditions, it doesn't work. And you know, that's definitely from my experience anyway. While some variations exist, well-known Housing First programs in North America, the EU, or New Zealand all look more similar than different. Experience from the national implementation plan of Housing First in other countries has shown that when Housing First programs adhere to these principles and practices and operate programs with a high degree of fidelity, that's faithfulness to the principles, participants achieve higher rates of housing stability and significantly greater improvements in the quality of their life. So that's really important as well, the final aspect there. So Housing First provides an effective solution for individuals who have repeatedly tried and failed to exit homelessness. So lots of people have given up on the treatment and then housing staircase approach, or have been giving up on the systems that regard them potentially as treatment resistant, hard to reach, not housing ready, homeless, rough sleeping by choice. Housing First proven success factors include the following. Housing First consistently shows significantly better outcomes than standard care in reducing homelessness, increasing housing stability, and improving quality of life. The Housing First client-directed approach empowers clients to make their own choices, to direct their own course of action, and experience a sense of mastery in the services of better in the recovery process. I think we just touched on that in the context of personal choice and self-directed care plans. Housing First can be implemented quickly because engagement with clients is accelerated by the offer of immediate access to housing. So it's not a condition, it's not a promise, it's not a persuasive tool, but in the context of the model, in terms of fidelity, you know, when we have housing stock, we try and allow for choice as much as possible, but we don't approach our sleepers or long-term homeless or the service participants involved until we know we have the properties. And by, I suppose, aligning with the fidelity, it's average 4 to 6 weeks before the service participant will move in. Again, along with that, depending on the property, whether it's turnkey, which is unlikely, you could be looking at some of the local authority houses, we might have renovation works to do in them from a housing side, and also once the service participant or the housing first new tenant accepts the offer, you're looking at furniture grants and white good grants and stuff like that to get it all ready before they move in. So in that sense, what you have, it does not require years to build. The program secures housing from the existing vacancies in social housing or by renting units. Like I said, we have very little dependency on renting units, thankfully, at some levels. Like we do have in our rapid rehousing and our housing support. But renting units from private landlords, on average, clients move from homelessness into their own apartment in a period of 4 to 6 weeks. Just mentioned that. So Housing First case management and treatment services take a holistic, recovery-orientated approach that supports community integration and social inclusion. So in terms of operationally, we would facilitate, daily communication meetings between our clinical nurse managers, clinical psychologists, occupational therapists, case managers, and we will have daily communication meetings facilitated by our operations coordinator or team leader, and operation meetings, which will be focused on service delivery, like who we're meeting, why we're meeting them, where we're meeting them, what for, what was the outcome. All that would be logistically and meticulously, I suppose, itemized, and we would have regular care planning meetings where all aspects, members of the team and a multidisciplinary team would contribute to, obviously, following discussion with the service participant or tenant. And we would have what we would call, I would term, I suppose, introduce a service development action plan meeting monthly, which really would be a wish list for all disciplines. What's missing? What would make our job easier? How can we provide a better service for our tenants? And we just try and tick them off as we go along. What's realistic? What's not? In terms of ancillary staff, students, health support assistants, from office space to tablets for our clients, or smartphones, etc. Right across the board, from small things to more large things, to try and make it the most robust and effective services that we can. So who is prioritized for Housing First? Individuals prioritized by Housing First are people who experience rough sleeping and those who have long stays in emergency accommodation with accompanying high support needs around mental health and substance use disorders. Again, that can be varied in different regions. In Ireland, 6 months homelessness in emergency accommodation would be considered long-term homeless. It might vary in different jurisdictions around Europe. But ultimately, it's long-term homeless, rough sleepers, people with complex needs, or originally three multiple needs exclusions. And there is varying measurement tools in terms of the acuity scores, which came from the Denver model and the Calgary model. But in general, in practice, as I mentioned, via the National Implementation Plan in Ireland, we used the Venn diagram. Other people used the Homeless Action Team referral system. It's not a matter of which is better. There's different regions, different nuances, different resources, and different complexities, but whatever works in each area. The evidence from studies of Housing First also indicates that clients are more likely to remain housed when programs allow them greater choice. That's the first part of section 1. Is there any questions on that? So in the context of the learning outcomes, the objective, what is Housing First? So I suppose in the summary, Housing First is an evidence-based, integrated approach that targets long-term rough sleepers, people with complex needs, addiction, mental health, long stays in emergency accommodation, to provide them with permanent housing, affordable housing, quality housing, supported by the major stakeholders, the local authorities, the councils, municipalities, the NGOs or the homeless organisations, and the health system.
Sorry, Mark, can I ask a question?
Yes, William.
Hi, my name is William Mansfield. I'm a Tenant Relations Officer for Respond Housing. And I've just taken about this fantastic what you're telling us here today. I just thought of, what is there a good recovery rate from addictions with this approach to housing?
It's a good question, William. And there's a lot of studies that need to be, what there is, I suppose, the focus for housing first is on harm reduction, you know?
Yeah.
So in the context of obviously abstinence would be the ideal scenario, which are working with the practicalities of the here and now. So whatever somebody is using in terms of recovery, I'm assuming you mean addiction, William, I suppose, or mental health in that sense. But so you're kind of working where they are and the practicalities of now. So whatever, trying to reduce the risk of, be it non-compliant medication-wise in the context of mental health and the issues that they may experience, and also in terms of alcohol and substance misuse. What I do know in the context of, as you mentioned, tenancy relation officer, but in terms of tenancy breakdown, it's never because of mental health issues or drug or alcohol use alone. It can be from excessive drug or alcohol use, you know, which usually coexists with antisocial behaviour from visitors, and which become huge issues at times. But in terms of harm reduction, yes, it's a significant element of it. But we have really some complex cases, I suppose, anecdotally, of addiction, and and people in treatment centres at the moment. Statistically wise, in terms of empirical studies, I'm not sure is the answer in terms of it, but I'm certainly sure of the evidence is there in terms of quality of life, in terms of psychological safety, physical safety, in terms of reducing alcohol. We'll come on to the harm reduction later. We're reducing substance misuse, William, and the context, and that can vary in many terms, from naloxone to the opiate substitute treatment, methadone, Suboxone, from diet, from provision there, and someone, I suppose, the intricate, somebody is consume spirits like vodka or whiskey, areas where you're trying to cut them down to wine or cider or whatever it might be, and you can keep if the tenant doesn't keep drink diaries or substance diaries, when the key workers will, and you can match the days literally when they went off the harm reduction model, the days when they had no money left, the days when they got assaulted, the days when they had a fall and they ended up in hospital, are generally the days that they didn't comply themselves with their agreed harm reduction approach, in terms of either reducing or changing the strength of the substance they're using. So, and that would be a great piece, William, to execute in that, to see it. Generally, the qualitative aspect is hard to measure. We can see people being happier, safer, and safer drug use, and safer psychologically for mental health issues. But trying to measure it is not as straightforward. We say we are looking at maybe from the statutory stakeholders, they can see, look, you have 40 people going in at the beginning, 40 people were using substances, and there's still 40 people using substances 3 years later. You'd say, where is the improvement? But we quantifiably, but qualitatively, we'd say, well, they're still housed, they haven't gone to prison, they haven't ended up in hospital, they're feeling happy, they're doing employment and training courses, they don't use heroin anymore, they're not using it intravenously, they're smoking it, and that's what the qualitative evidence is there. But if it's if you're just looking, if particularly statutory stakeholders or funders are looking for quantifiable, quantitative evidence, it's not, it doesn't look as convincing on paper, but the qualitative aspect is really strong, and that's the important part.
Absolutely.
Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. So in essence, that's the conclusion of section 1, in the context of what is housing first. We covered that. Why? Because we're looking at a cohort of people who didn't fit the traditional staircase model, and who before I ever worked in homelessness, you go traveling on Berlin or Dublin, Cork, Rome, and you see, London, and I go back every year, and you see the same people on the streets. And, I had no understanding of it, but I suppose these were the people with mental health issues and addiction issues that are being missed. And and it does cost the state, actually, as we know, financially more money in terms of in the context of prison custodial sentences, in the context of court experiences, in the context of hospitalization, in the context of long-term usage of emergency shelters, but never really fitted the criteria for housing readiness. And which we come on to now, and the housing first approach allows an opportunity to focus on those, not exclusively. Housing first alone will not work, can't work, because obviously there's new people entering homelessness, there's people with less complex needs, they need to be housed. There's, the housing prices, the rental market in Ireland and all across Europe is very high. And so there's huge lack of affordable and social housing. So there's huge issues all around, but it does complement all the other approaches. And it's value for money if you take everything into account. It requires the right approach. There's different ways to do it, but regardless of what type of model it is, the fidelity to the principles are need to be consistent as best we can. And so that's why who we mentioned a lot, and what is it, and does it work? Yeah, we'll cover that. She covered some of it there, but we'll cover that in the conclusion as well in terms of evidence-based. Hopefully that answers some of your questions, not specifically recovery, William, but generically in terms of the success rates, in terms of the Cheswan program in France, Canada, New Zealand, Finland, Ireland, Scotland, the UK, Spain, right across the board, really. There's evidence there. We might cover some of them this afternoon. But is there any other, thanks, William, great question. Is there any other people who would like to ask a question?
Yeah, can I come in there, Deirdre McCarthy? I work with Bill as well in Respond Housing. It sounds great, Mark. I'm just looking here in front of me at the stairs, and I'm looking at jumping from the end to the top, from the staircase model. And I'm wondering, how does it work? It sounds great to be able to get in and have all these wraparound services and everything, but very often we say we may take somebody from transitional in, and then they stop their supports and they won't answer their door, or they refuse to engage in certain supports. And where are you then? You're caught with somebody in the middle of housing with other people, and they won't answer the door, they won't pay their rent, the house is a mess, they F you out, but if you knock at the door, and yet if they're going through a model of transitional where they're going through a program of, with finances, monetary, all those kind of things of how to keep the house, how to pay their bills, how to, do all that, but they skip all that and they jump straight in, and then they're left on their own to manage. Now, I know you say they're not left on their own, you have all these wraparound services, but I'm just wondering what happens when they don't answer that door. How are you caught then as a landlord?
No, brilliant question. I think there's a few stages to that. There's no clear antidote solution, because we still have those problems, housing first too. Right? But I think in the context of, for us, it's just like you mentioned, transitional housing. There's a lot of pre-work as well. I suppose in terms of housing first, there might be, I know from previous training, people think you're literally taking someone from the street, and now you're not saying this at all, and you're in a house, and then you wrap around the supports, and you hope for the best, and you might engage or not. And that was my assumption before I worked in housing first, and it was a misconception of mine as well. The pre-work that's done, Deirdre, is quite forensic in the context. I think a lot of the value to it is when we're working with somebody with 4 to 6 weeks before we go in, it's really around strengths based. What are you good at? What type of housing would you like? Where were you most happy? And if you have that to offer them, in terms of area, jurisdiction, and ideally housing first is 20% max in the context of housing first clients in a particular house. So it's not the congregated settings so you're hoping to assimilate them into the community as much as possible. So it's not like I have a lot of properties with my rapid housing and tenancy support systems where it's all people with complex needs, homelessness, and it's all, the issues are sometimes associated with terms of visitors and potential drug dealing, etc. But I think from the early stages in terms of the choice, their control of this, no, I don't want to live in that area. I don't want this house. If you have those options, and these are hard to fidelity, and building up the strengths and part of the pre-work in terms of the assessments, the happiness scales, and developing their own care plans. And there is 3 preconditions, and say no preconditions as in first, but he must pay the rent. If this is in the 4 to 6 weeks, discussed, and obviously it isn't pre-tenancy as well, and he must have a visit of the key worker at least once a week, and to the same expectancy with their lease or tenancy agreement as any other tenants in the community. So from the get-go, you have a little bit of a window. Doesn't always work in terms of when you chose this, you chose that. These are your strengths. This is what you're good at. This is when you're most happiest. And also we try and tie in as early as possible, Deirdre. You'd be familiar with it. I'd say the household budget, rented source, so that piece is taken. Also the household budget, the utilities like gas or electricity, taken out of it as well. So that's something they've controlled it, but they've chosen to do so. So you don't have those aspects there. In the context of you're right when you slam the door or won't open it, and won't cooperate with key working or clinical supports, it's really gone on to another principle. And we have these problems too. I suppose one you're looking at least they're not in the streets or they're not in the shelter, but are they being housed safely is the question. But it comes back for us in the context of the principle of active engagement without coercion. So you're still there, you're still using your motivational techniques, your brief interventions, your understanding of trauma-informed care, which is in some of these cases is clearly a reaction or their coping mechanism to experiencing trauma, whatever type it was, in terms of substance misuse or hypermania or lashing out or refusing to engage. Usually it's a fear response. And it's trying to consistently say, well, listen, you're not accepting this at the moment, but this is what I can offer. I'm going to be back again tomorrow, and you can shout at me inside the door. It's not taking it personally, I suppose, as such, and trying, as I said, active engage with them without coercion. There is a time when it's unsafe for them or unsafe for others. Technically in the pathways, housing first model, there's no discharge policy. But at times you have to, obviously there's clear evidence of drug dealing and put people at risk or sexual assaults or assault, etc. There was times, in my experience with Housing First, since we started in 2000, officially in 2019, following the implementation of Plan 2018, we've had one eviction. Sorry, we had one, but it was because of safety issues for this person. And he actually surrendered his tenancy. And we did rehouse him. We worked with him when he was in emergency accommodation. And the nurses, the clinical nurses, the case managers, the DOT, the psychologist, and we rehoused him 6 months later. And he's about 7 months and he's no. So there was a gap where he's brought back to emergency. But it's a long haul.
But it is. And it's very hard to go to eviction when you're dealing with mental health issues.
Yes.
It'd be very hard to get an eviction when you're dealing with mental health issues. And then when you have to consider the other tenants within the block or whatever it is. I mean, in one case we have where there's an apartment underneath this person and we just can't let it. We've let it a couple of times and we've had to take people out of there because they couldn't cope because of the person upstairs. But it's just I'm seeing, but we're skipping a few models. We're skipping the transitional and we're skipping the shelter and how. Now what I hear from you is that you're saying, well, some of that work is done in the background before you move the person in. That's what you're saying, when you're talking about the household budget and all that. So why not do that in a transitional housing stage? That's all I'm wondering. Sorry now, but I just can't get the moving straight from the street into a house without any training and background and how to cope and living on dealing with bills and rent and cooking and, you know, all these things.
It's a very good point, Deirdre, because both models are not exclusive. We require both as such, you know.
Yeah.
In the context
And
of
you
not-
said there was no preconditions, but you're saying there is some
Well,
preconditions.
there is the key working the rent and following the terms of your lease like everybody else, you know, in terms of, but, and you're also right about it's very hard to evict somebody with mental illness because fundamentally you don't want to.
Well, that's the last thing you want to do.
Yeah. And it's your understanding of trauma as well, you know.
Yeah.
And also legally, in terms of the Rented Tenancies Board in Ireland, you know, it's not going to address somebody's mental health issues, you know, it's unless it's really antisocial behavior involved. So, but the evidence shows internationally by going to housing first, as opposed to the staircase model, that it has proven to have a higher percentage rate of successful exits from homelessness and permanently housing people. It doesn't take away the issues, but what it does is that you sustain them. The evidence is there internationally that there's greater success rate in exits from homelessness. Like I said, where it's very average is 85% in housing first. It's much lower in the traditional model. Again, they're not exclusive; they're inclusive to each other in that context. But you know, they are complicated, and these are the real issues when it comes down to after the nice stuff, and you know, and the positive stuff. But there's real day-to-day operational issues involved as well. You know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Is there any other questions?
Well, I would, hi, this is Dima. I'm a human rights officer at the UN Human Rights Office. You may get to this a bit later. Thank you so much so far. It's really interesting. You may get to it later, but I'd be interested in a little bit more detail on when you mentioned the choices available to the individual. You mentioned about location, where they could, you know, choosing this area over that area. How they want to organize their budget, but I'd be interested in a bit more details on what what options are available and how what kind of support individuals receive in making those choices. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Dima. So in the context of the choices, again, it depends. Obviously, we're looking at fidelity, but sometimes you can't reach high standards of fidelity. You may not have housing stock. You may not have the desired location. You may not have a ground floor, for example. It may not be a standalone unit. It may be in a block of flats. It may be outside of a bus route. It may not be near a pharmacy for methadone. So you have all these challenges, etc. at times. And sometimes you have to kind of cut your cloth and go with what you have. But where you have, and you just try to stick to it, I suppose, where possible in terms of fidelity, is where you can offer choice. And if that's a choice of locations, or a choice of your own front door, or a choice of where it's an apartment block, where you're shared communal areas, but there is no choice around paying rent in terms of how it can be set up and paying your bills in that context. So you're looking at choice in that way, Dima, where you have the opportunity to do it. So in the context of fidelity, particularly there's other models of fidelity, but fidelity via pathways, which the main approach, it should be carried out every 6 months or 12 months. So for example, if I could not offer, or my team could not offer choice to a particular tenant, and this was the only one here, stay in the shelter or stay above sleeping, or do you want this? We work with you towards this. But there is choice in terms of choosing your furniture. If it's not on, if you get once you get out in terms of your white goods, in terms of coloring of the house, in terms of being involved in that painting, not painting, but the color of it, the decor, the layout, again, depending on the grant, etc. So there's a sense of belonging and ownership here, and it's focusing on your strengths where possible. And, but in terms of fidelity, if you're looking at aspects where we don't have those options, you're really then measuring that. So in a sense, in the sense of fidelity, obviously there's different grades where you might have, on that particular aspect of choice, you might have got a very low grade. It could be self-assessment in the context of where it was just average, where you're trying to get to the next stage the following year, obviously in terms of improved fidelity, great fidelity, excellent fidelity in different areas. So it's and there's certain fidelity tools that allow you to grade that in terms of, and also the other aspect of choice, Dina. I'm not sure if you were referencing that as well. Is the choice, I suppose, whether to comply with treatment or not, in terms of or abstinence from substances or being medication wise compliant in terms of your mental health. So there's a double side of the choice. But choice is important in terms of strengths based, in terms of it does evidence based in that when people choose either their care plans or the type of location, property, there's a greater success rate involved. It might go back to answering some of Bill's question or Deirdre's question as well, hopefully. But when all that is included, it does lend to greater outcomes at the end. And so I don't know if that answered your question somewhat, Dina.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank you, Dina. So that's section one. Questions were great, by the way. I think that was the most interesting part. And if it works for you, we could take a break until 3 o'clock or 3:05. We say 5:05, and we come back for section two, which is only going to be about half an hour, maybe less, depending on the questions. It's just going to try to what Deirdre highlighted there, and in terms of housing first. I don't like the versus the staircase model. It's just the differences between the approach, and we look a little bit more at fidelity. I think then we'll spend most of our time, hopefully, on the principles and of housing first after that. Hello, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to section two. We're going to look briefly at the staircase model and fidelity to housing first, to the principles. So in summary, the staircase model, and Deirdre made some very good points there in reference to it. And I mean, the staircase model works for a lot of people. I wouldn't change it in that sense, in terms of how the difference is, I suppose, the cohort of the people housing first are trying to target are the long-term rough sleepers, people who have failed tendencies behind them, who have traumatic experiences maybe of it, a feeling of rejection and failure. And that's where the housing first approach from homelessness or to street to permanent housing kind of comes in. So it's a matter really of complementing each other, really, because the local knowledge in terms of the traditional staircase model, in terms of support workers, the tenancy support workers, the local authorities, the case managers, is so invaluable, and it's shared knowledge, really. So it's really to complement it, to capture the cohort of the people with multiple needs exclusions, maybe repeated tenancy breakdowns, evictions.
Mark, can I just say something there as well, just to echo that? I work in the homeless services side of Respond, and I guess you mentioned the trauma-informed care earlier. That's very much where we would work from, because we'd see time and time again, and I saw it in my previous job with another housing agency, that often people who are the most traumatized and who have been through the most trauma and the most setbacks feel that they're then looking to be rewarded with the house, if you engage in key work, and if you're seen to make progress through the trauma that wasn't your fault, then we will reward you with the house. And then even in their own minds, one small setback is then almost, a black mark against them, or they're being punished, and the hopelessness sets in then again. So we would very much be aligned to the housing first model and to the working with through, get yourself housed, get yourself safe and warm and all of that. And then let's look at what are the issues, how can we address them now that you feel kind of safe and taken care for all of almost,
Brilliant, Nadine. It's very good, absolutely. And because, from experience of nearly 20 years working at homeless services also, it's impossible to work effectively with somebody on the streets.
Absolutely.
For them to deal with their issues or in emergency accommodation. And at least it's a starting point. It doesn't mean the problems have gone away. There's no, we're not asking them obviously we'd like to see absence, etc., and quality of life to improve, but it may not happen. But it may not happen overnight. It may not happen, but you will see generally incremental improvements. Just in your mindset, absolutely, I think, and and it's great to hear because trauma-informed approach is really a strong aspect to housing first environment. And and then it's trying to go back to Deirdre's point as well about because my experience of being trauma-informed, of working with somebody who has adverse childhood experiences, but also though we have to be the other person it might be affecting has adverse childhood experiences possibly as well. So it's kind of, in a sense, but you mentioned a very important word there, reward, which is right, because as I think, what you're really highlighting is that, and rightfully so, is that housing isn't a reward, it's a human right.
Exactly.
And spot on. And, as defined in Article 25 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's 1948. It's a bit old, but it's and so you're spot on, AD. And again, it's just trying to balance that as well. But
it is about balancing it because as you say, you're the person living alongside you, even in emergency services, could also be traumatized and could be affected by how your trauma is presenting itself. So if you're presenting yourself as aggressive because of your trauma, and the person alongside you is also trying to work their way to their forever home, it's about what we would find here in the service. And we have a small service here, which allows us to thankfully, spend a lot of time working with the individuals. And that's just it. You have to work with them as individuals, as opposed to one rule suits all or one size fits all. If this happens on the site, you're out, you're evicted. Obviously, we try to avoid that at all costs, because what we're trying to do all along is look at this individual, look at their traumas, their issues, what's coming up for them, where they need to be, and then trying to, assure the person living alongside them that, you may not be aware of all the conversations that are happening in this person's key working no more than they would be aware of what's happening in yours. And let's just keep concentrating on our own individual cases to get where we want to be. And I know that's all, as you know, Mark, that's it simply wrapped up. But I think once you kind of continue to focus on the trauma, where they're coming from, and how can we bring them through that without rewarding them for progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely,
Yeah.
Aideen. Great points. Super. Thanks. Thank you. So there is a diagram there of the staircase model and the housing first approach. And I just briefly went off that. So just the old assumption again, it's not necessarily the old assumption. I think it can work in parallel. The steps of the system designed to help people who are homeless to address their issues, stabilize and become ready for housing. There's nothing wrong with that. Except for that, we're looking at a cohort that have repeated tenancy breakdown, or in some cases never got a chance, and are still, have complex issues that not even aware of in some cases themselves. But permanent, except for the reward word you use there as well, I think. So the newer understanding, aligned with permanent housing, is the stable base. It enables recovery. That's the hope. Housing people without preconditions and then bringing appropriate supports to them is the way to end homelessness and sustain housing and people in their homes. So that's in the short, but I think you really did put up some good points to reading in reference to trauma informed, because you're always trying to balance that, because as we mentioned, the other person might be affected by someone's behavior, which is predominantly a coping mechanism to deal with their issues or deflect or fight, flight or fight, should I say, and I suppose inability to emotionally regulate their emotions. But it has the impact potentially on someone else, and they're thinking, actually, they have their own experience, but they're not being listened to or not being supported, etc. So it is really about balancing that. It's really significant. So in the context, so that's just the main difference, but there isn't. We can work successfully together. The idea of the housing first, the street or homelessness to housing, permanent, secure, safe housing, affordable housing, with wraparound supports, with the hope that they have a better environment to stabilise and deal with their issues, is for that cohort. And that same cohort, in terms of the complex needs of sleeping, long-term homelessness, have predominantly used up all the bed nights in emergency accommodation over the years and all the resources because of the poor health conditions in terms of health resources as well. So there actually there's evidence in Ireland, in Dublin, for example, in the context where this cohort of rough sleepers, for example, could take up of 50% of resources from emergency accommodation and support services. So you're moving all that and allowing for more support for vulnerable homeless people by providing housing on the other end. So it's important to recognise that as well. So does anybody else want to come in there in the context of the staircase model and the housing first approach? It's okay. So in brief, we just look at the Finnish model again. So the Finnish model is very important in the context. It's nearly exclusively, and this is some of the information here is a bit dated, but exclusively resolved rough sleeping in many practically, And what's interesting for me about the Finnish model, it's a similar population to Ireland and the approach, but it's the stakeholders buy-in. It's an objective from the state to resolve homelessness and rough sleeping, and it can be done. And Finland approved that. It's different from pathways in the context. The Finnish model focuses more not on the scattered sites where the pathways model is predominantly 20% of housing first service participants or tenants in one area, and whereas it's more congregated settings in the Finnish model and the context of refurbishing dorms, hostels, old hotels, etc. But to a point, but they're still aligned with the core principles of housing first around harm reduction, choice, person-centered, separation from housing, and supports housing as a human right. So whatever way we get the job done is the key there, I think. And so there's different models and different approaches. And but the Finnish model, like I said, has been seen particularly positive results from housing first since 2008. National homeless strategies have been based on the housing first model as part of an integrated approach between the state, municipalities, and NGOs. I'm not sure if NGOs is international, but non-governmental organizations, which would be the homeless services, etc. Building and buying new housing was one of the most important goals of the Finnish national programme to reduce long-term homelessness. A major aspect of the programme was the extensive conversion of shelters and dormitory-style hostels into supported housing. For example, the last major hostel for people who are homeless in Helsinki comprised 250 bed spaces, and this was converted into 80 independent apartments. New on-site support services were tailored to meet the needs of individual tenants. Finland has all but eliminated rough sleeping and housed a significant number of people who are long-term homeless. So the present national policy programme launched by the government in June 2016 now focuses on the prevention of homelessness. So there have shifted from housing rough sleepers and long-term homeless to their focus just on keeping them in their homes, which is something that we all can aspire to. So that was just a brief look at the staircase model and the Finnish model. So section 3 is core principles of housing first. These are the 8 core principles. They've been adapted and modified over the years. If it's okay with you, we'll go straight into it without taking a break. If it's okay with the group and Matilda, excuse me, and we might get a chance maybe to finish a bit earlier this evening as well, because I know we're all busy. So the 8 core principles, and these are crucial to the success of housing first programs. The closer to fidelity we have to these, and as Dina mentioned earlier, sometimes, particularly on the choice aspect, we don't always get as close to the fidelity as we would like. But the point is, we know where the gaps are, and we try to address them going forward. So housing is a human right, as you mentioned earlier. Choice and control for service users. Separation of housing and treatment come in at any stage if anybody wants to question what they are. We will be going into it in a little bit more detail shortly. Recovery orientation. So recovery, and Bill had mentioned it earlier, and recovery is not just in the context of recovery from addiction, but it's a recovery in the context of mental health. Also, that is a critical component of Housing First. Oops. So harm reduction, I think we mentioned some aspects of that earlier, and we covered it again now. Active engagement without coercion. Again, we discussed that briefly. Person-centered planning and flexible support for as long as required. So in essence, by covering the background of Housing First, the overview, we've touched on all of those principles in the mix of describing what is Housing First, why Housing First, and who is Housing First for, and does Housing First work. That's the core element, I suppose, of the introduction to Housing First. So following up on those core principles, just have a look at in more detail. Oh dear. So the principles of Housing.
Sorry, Mark, do you find, sorry, I'm Denise, I also
Oh,
work
Denise.
in the homeless section of Respond. Do you find that while we work from a person-centered, strengths-based approach, you know, using the positivities to bring out the best in everyone that they can, you know, do you find sometimes that government bodies, and we're working from a social care aspect, that sometimes government bodies find this difficult to accept and understand?
Denise, again, it's a very good question. And in short, yes. You know, I can't give a politically correct answer.
Yeah,
And again, you know, I speak for different regions. It's just that, but that's our duty. You know what I mean? As a Housing First practitioner, I mean, I didn't understand Housing First or want to. You know, I can remember aspects of when I was working in the emergency side, and you know, Cork was a region, was an opiate-free city. It's gone back a long time now, but you know, in the early noughties, and it didn't have a heroin problem, for example. And I was working service leader for the emergency accommodation, and you know, because a lot of our clients came from jurisdictions that had, when you could travel without centre of interest and all this stuff, and habitual residency clauses, they'd come from Holland to get, because they know in the homeless scene that Cork was opiate free, and they're just trying to get away from it. They couldn't get the treatment or come from the UK, and that was an only kind of association with it. But then when it started coming in, when we started opening up our economy and you know, and travel and how stuff came in, I was getting out. I said, no way am I hanging around for, you know, heroin in the emergency shelter, and the risk to staff and the risk to other service participants and tenants, and my lack of understanding about, you know, we got emergency key to the trainers and needle exchange and the rest, and harm reduction understanding, and you know, and it just made me realize by actually thinking that, saying, well, if somebody's coming in here who's a heroin user and is actively using, and I was saying no, they can't come in, I was actually excluding the most vulnerable person out there, had all the
absolutely.
I was part of that, you know, my lack of understanding. And
it's more of a parental approach, isn't it? The archaic kind of thinking of the, you know, the parental punitive approach. And I think sometimes government bodies still take, I suppose they don't have the social care aspect to the difficulties that the cohort of people that Housing First is aimed at. You know, it's the punitive measures. You know, we're going back to trauma informed. I suppose pre-trauma informed, it was just basic kindness, wasn't it?
A humanistic approach, yeah, absolutely. And we're kind of coming back to that with trauma informed as well, because it goes back to the old, when they're ready, you know, as opposed to refer working, there's addiction, there's housing, etc. And it is, and in a sense, it's a very important point, Denise, because it's where we, you know, because I know the transition I had to make to embrace or to actually deal with the real issues in homelessness. As opposed to just a health and safety aspect, or saying, oh, well, you know, they refuse to go to see the psychiatrist 3 times, now they're off the list. You know, and that was the whole, you know, even though that expert knowledge or support was kind of gone because of the profiles of our clients who are not good at meeting appointments for obvious reasons. So it's about bringing all those services to them. So use the expertise of the macro system in the health system, but to adapt it to the person-centered approach to tenants, and so to have you have the expertise, but now you have a new way of doing things. And likewise with trauma informed and housing first, you find because people have different pressures or under different expediencies to get stuff done, and they've refused 3 flats already. What do you do? So take you have, because there's so much pressure, particularly in
I
Ireland.
suppose this is where the never the twain shall meet, I feel at times. We're basing and we're working from harm reduction model, person-centered, trauma-informed, but the people with the housing stock are, the AHBs, they're managing them for the government. So the government a lot of the time have the final say at all these allocations meetings, and they're still using the kind of the carrot stick approach. Well, if you behave, you can have a house. If you meet your psychiatrist 3 times a week, well then, yeah, you're working really well. They're not, I suppose, taking into consideration what we're taking into. So I think we can be talking about housing first and learning about housing first, but I think a lot and trauma informed, and they are fantastic bases to work from. They're essential for people to work from those perspectives and looking at strengths-based approach with people. However, I feel the people that have the housing stock and in control of the housing stock are possibly absent at these important events, learning about them, and I'm wondering, is there something that can be done about that in a broader perspective?
I think exactly, Denise. And I think that's why, that's my job. Right? If you know what I mean, that's hopefully would be your job, in a sense, if you further participate with Fiansta and Europe Housing First Hub, is that you become trainers and facilitators, and you bring it to your own region. So,
and you get the toe in the door and you don't let them lock it.
Yes, yeah. So, but exactly, but it takes time. But we need to run training and run programs about it, maybe more often, to make it more effective. That is a core element of the pathways model, what you're describing there. And you can get it in a sense with multidisciplinary teams as well within Housing First, across the regions. Is that we have different ways of doing things, but that's healthy. It's about coming to a consensus on it as well. And I think also, so really that's the role of what we're here for. And that this time next year or whatever, to be yourself delivering this type of training, and if you wanted to, and also you actually mentioned the core elements of it, because I think in any Housing First project, it is exactly those case management skills. It is the trauma-informed approach. It is the motivational interviewing. And these are the core skills, brief interventions, and an understanding of Housing First. And you have those, it will be successful, with all the person-centered and self-directive approach goes with it. So I agree with you, but I think the responsibility is back to us, to me and colleagues, to make those in a piecemeal way and a respectful way to influence the stakeholders. Because the wonderful thing about it, Denise, and you really hit the nail on the head again as well, because it doesn't work without them. It doesn't work.
It can't.
It can't work without them.
Yeah.
So
and it needs to be more than a blurb, a tick box exercise that we're trauma informed, or we're person centered, or we do this, and behind it all is still the archaic kind of
it takes
way of thinking.
Yes, but I would say, in my own experience in my region, we really have developed, and it's critical important aspect of Housing First, really good relationships with the local authority, that's the municipalities, for everybody else, or the councils. They've really bought into Housing First, and the communication systems, the meetings, the allocations, the prioritization through the Venn diagram. It's all mutually, collectively agreed, and following the fidelity. And I would say that in the 3 regions we work in the country, and it's and in a sense, there's a great trust on my colleagues and the teams I work with in that when it comes to the day-to-day decisions and stuff, the operations and stuff, which is part of the process as well, they do trust the expertise of the case management, of the clinical nurse management, of the OT, occupational therapist, and the clinical science to do to do it once the communication levels is quite good and shared. So I think we've got to that stage, where with this, because you cannot be a successful project without the buy-in of the statutories, be it from the health side or from the local authorities, the council side. And that's the key. And I think when you get there, you'll always have challenges, because you always and like we say, within a team, you'll always have positive challenges as well. And I'm trying to make everything positive, but I mean, challenges and such. But the nub of it is back to the training, the sharing of it, and the relationships, and the skills that you mentioned, the trauma-informed care, the case management, the motivation interviewing,
and genuine buy-in. Is
and
really
genuine
important.
buy-in. And it's not the be-all, like I said, it's part of the process. And
absolutely.
It will catch that cohort that have been missed for forever, for decades. Good stuff.
Thanks, Mark.
No, excellent. Thank you. So continuing with that, principles of Housing First, a number of key principles are associated with Housing First. Housing First programs that follow these principles have been found to achieve broadly the same high success rates. The 8 principles below or above are drawn from the Housing First Guide 2014-2016, which is closely based on the principles contained in the original Housing First handbook developed by Dr. Sam Decembers in 2010. So on all that part of the training as well, and I know most of you might be familiar with Sam Decembers, but he spent frequently the last decade in Ireland working with the statutories, working with the NGOs, doing a lot of research, facilitating a lot of training, and that's key to it as well in that aspect. And obviously through Europe Hub, Housing First Europe Hub, we've collected, there's been 3 cohorts of people all around Europe who've been meeting. Unfortunately, COVID has restricted a lot of it now, but we're hoping for a 4th cohort where it's trained the trainers on all these issues, which you'd all be welcome to, and to become facilitators in that aspect of your work as well. So that's a critical component of it. And there's loads of resources you can get from Matilda in the context of from Fianza and Housing First Europe Hub, the Europe Homeless Hub, etc. But even from the Canadian observation and homelessness as well, some great materials. Sam Decembers himself, who some of you might know from the Irish context, has recently, or at the beginning of the year, produced a manual for Housing First in Ireland, which I can send to Matilda, and she can send out to all of you if you want, and it's, if you don't have it already. But it's really, it is really a toolkit for the day-to-day stuff we're talking about as well, and how to address some of the issues that arises. So immediate access to housing without preconditions. So Housing First programs help their clients obtain immediate access to independent homes scattered throughout neighbourhoods or apartment blocks with regular tenancies and a range of off-site supports. Come in at any time again, guys, in terms of questions, please. Principle 2, choice and control. And Deema's point earlier, looking for clarity and that for service users. The services provided by the Housing First team are client-led, so that the individual chooses the timing, nature, and extent of services offered. Not always the case. I think it's a big one. We fall down in fidelity sometimes as well, because we're dealing with restrictions, the economy of things, the resources, and maybe all you have to offer is just one aspect. Sometimes we don't have anything to offer. Principle 3, separation of housing and treatment. Housing support and treatment services are provided separately. Housing First tenants are required to follow the same terms of the tenancy like anyone else or everyone else, but the individual does not have to engage in treatment to access or remain in housing. Equally, tenancy breakdown does not affect the individual's access to treatment. So that is the separation, which is a very important part of the resources required in Housing First in terms of a separate platform or or team to provide a housing site, which generally deals with the landlords or the antisocial side of aspects if they materialise, and the support and the treatment side. They're very important to have those separated. And so, that's critical too. Again, the preconditions around treatment or meds compliance doesn't come into it, but you'll find from the intensity or the regularity of the pre-tenancy and contact with colleagues and staff that it's a very open kind of professional relationship in terms of what's going on for people, and which is great in the context of it when you have clinical staff also who bring their expertise and their advice to it, but can bring it down to a day-to-day working level with staff and with the tenants and service participants. Recovery orientation, as Bill was questioning earlier, or made a good point. It's not just about mental health, but it's about addiction, but it's about mental health also. So housing first services focus on the overall well-being of an individual, including their physical health, mental health, social support, family and friends, and integration into the wider community. I think the last sentence is critically important. And luckily enough in Cork Simon, we have a really extensive employment and training project and activities project that allows that side of things in terms of social support and family integration and potential for employment and education and training. So that's a critical element of it. I think it's an element that I think most housing first projects are kind of focusing on, because we have managed the retention of people in their homes, but it's getting to that next level of quality of life and measuring that as well is the key to it. And I can give you anecdotal examples as well in the context of social integration and meeting family. There's a simple scenario with one particular service participant or tenant who was homeless, rough sleeping, in and out of all types of projects with us in Ireland, and had a lot of issues with incontinence, mobility, Korsakoffs, and literally used to kind of crawl on his backside when he was to walk at times, and but had no family contact for decades, and just to see him in his own home with the work of case managers and nurses and to see him ring in his sister or the staff to tell me about it, should I say, and the joy and the quality of life that brought, and the confidence and the self-esteem and other aspects to that person's life. It's really, really important. I know it's just a kind of an anecdotal story, but it's something that it can motivate people. It certainly motivated me, and it's great to see that aspect as well. Harm reduction, critical component of housing first. I think it's a critical component of all our work, in the medical side of things as well. It's obviously abstinence would be the ideal scenario in most scenarios, but it's reducing the risk of where people are at and the practicalities of it here and now. As a harm reduction offers support, help and treatment, but does not require individuals to abstain from drugs and alcohol. It seeks to encourage people to change behaviours around drug and alcohol use that cause them harm. It doesn't mean we condone illegality of any type at all, but in the context of just working where they're at and signposting them to services and to supports and the treatment, either within the service or externally, and hopefully keeping them as safe as possible. That can only work when the service participant or tenant is communicating with you, that is an open and trustful professional relationship there, that they can tell you what they're using as opposed to denying it. And again, that goes to the self-directive and the choice and the person-centered approach. Assertive engagement without coercion. I think we covered some of this earlier with Deirdre. So the housing first approach is to engage with service users in a positive but non-directive manner that promotes the belief that recovery is possible. It's really offering hope, which is really, really important. Persons, and somebody feels hopeful is the critical component of that. Person-centered planning Housing first services use person-centered planning, which essentially involves organising support and treatment around an individual and their needs, rather than expecting them to adjust and adapt to the services and offer. I think we mentioned that earlier as well. It's about getting the expertise from the macro systems, the health systems, etc. That sometimes some of the most vulnerable, for whatever reasons, don't get the services off because they, not great at appointments, inactive addiction, etc. It's adapting that expertise, bringing it into housing first, bringing it into our homes predominantly, and providing those services, and obviously arranging appointments and integrating it into external medical supports also. But it's always fundamentally focused on the person-centered planning. Again, if someone doesn't choose to do something, it's not really going to work. Flexible support for as long as required. Services are not time limited. Because individuals have mainstream tendencies, they can remain at a home and in the community where they are supported along their chosen path to recovery. So again, I think as Bill mentioned earlier about recovery, is that it's doesn't always reduce over time, particularly when some service participants have chronic health issues, particularly around incontinence or acquired brain injuries and alcohol-induced seizures. But it's remaining, sustaining the support with them for as long as it's required. So there are the 8 principles of housing first. Is there any questions on that?
Mark, can I ask you, with regards to Cork anyway, how many tenancies are there of this type of housing?
In Cork, Bill, we have, I suppose in the southwest region, we have 84 is the target. So in Cork City, it's 40. In Cork County, it's 14. And in County Kerry, it's 30. So we have just initiated, 2 years ago, we've initiated the Cork City. So we've 34 tenancies created in that time. In Cork County, we just initiated it this year. So we're at the early stages, we have 5. And in County Kerry, we have 3. Well, just on 3, which we only started a few months back.
And
so,
are these buildings or units, whatever you want to call them, are they purpose built, or were they already existing properties, or?
Already existing properties. In Cork City, someone would come through the approved, capital assistance scheme that we would have bought. Obviously, there's a cap on properties. I think it's around 197,000. Restricted to 1-bed properties, which is a challenge, Bill. That did come from the Pathways original model in terms of focusing on 1-bed properties. It's a challenge in that there's not that many of them out there. And I suppose the main reason behind it from the beginning was that having 2 beds could leave it open to antisocial behaviour, visitors, unauthorised visitors, etc. But I think we need to be moving a little bit towards the 2 beds because some people, because of their recovery, as you mentioned earlier, are maybe getting access with children under TUSLA approved or child protection approved, stuff like that. So something we really have to be looking at. And so most properties are bought within that, approved through the local authorities from capital assistance schemes, and we get the NGOs, the homeless agencies get them through that. 50% is provided from the local authorities bill, which would vary. A lot of them would be houses, I suppose, that maybe have been flats. In some of them standalone, which would be very good. Some, most of them, which is good, but predominantly in areas that would have been marginalised or would have had antisocial behaviour and might have even in some cases been boarded up, which means to get them prepared, you need a maintenance team and property management team to provide all those aspects as well.
With this approach, or does your approach to this type of housing, is it just with individuals, or can you do it with a couple, or can you do it with a family?
Good point, Bill, because it comes back to that. It's predominantly focused on individuals and singles, and that's where the housing first originally focused on in terms of in New York, in terms of single males and females, but predominantly suffering from mental health issues, diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar, and addiction issues. And from that, I suppose, from the evidence in Ireland that 74% of people occupying emergency accommodation are single. And so it's trying to move that. But it is a challenge for NGOs like ourselves to try and secure single beds, so it's single apartment flats. That has kind of been pretty strict throughout the national implementation plan. But there is some movement in the context of what I mentioned earlier. If somebody has, a statutory approved access to a child, or etc. But what you're really coming to now, Bill, for me, is the future, which is really important. Where do we go next? And it's kind of, maybe it's a question I ask at the end, but it's really around housing first just for single people. That's one aspect. Housing first in Ireland now is developing the justice system. People leaving incarceration, leaving prison. Also housing first for youths. I think there's huge areas for housing first with women and families, especially experiencing domestic violence. So I think that's huge areas where we need to be going with housing first, folks, people with disabilities. So these are key where it needs to expand to. I think that's the future of it. So you have a bit of vision there, Bill, where it needs to go. And because approved is restricted to one beds, predominantly single males, it is quite exclusive of what's really happening out there, especially in the context, and particularly in Ireland, where there's a lack of social and affordable housing. And as we all know, I think that's across Europe, let's be honest, and the rental market is just near nigh impossible to get into, and it's impossible to actually buy your own home, regardless of your income at this stage. And so there's huge, and these are really good ways, Bill, that we can target those most vulnerable groups of disability, people with disabilities, women and families experiencing domestic violence, men and families experiencing domestic violence, and people leaving the prison system, particularly young people. And so there's loads of areas to develop on this.
One more question there now. Is there such a thing as a waiting list for this type of housing?
Good point, because we go back to the prioritization of who's it for. So there is that. The one thing I've learned in housing and homelessness is that waiting lists it's creates a lot of disappointment, anxiety, frustration among staff, and people advocating from GPs, nurses themselves, thinking, I'm 2 years in the waiting list, etc. So you try and avoid that. So in the context of, so you have different systems even in Ireland, where you'd have you'd be familiar with it, the homeless action team might take referrals through that alongside the usual allocation meetings and that, but you kind of cut off a point of where you add to the waiting list until your house, say you have 7 people, until your house, there's no one else on the waiting list. So hopefully you dissipate that frustration that somebody's waiting for so long. In the particular model that we use to the Venn diagram in terms of compiling the numbers of frequent attendees at emergency departments, hospitals, psychiatric units, etc., combined from the local authorities. Some of you might be familiar with this in the context of the PASS system. Some of the people from other parts of Europe, but look, the number of bed nights in hospitals, combined local knowledge from the outreach workers, from the emergency shelter workers, from the health staff within them, the mental health team, etc., the addiction team, the nurses and the GP, they provide certain names. So we end up with a lot of names that we look at towards, do they meet the 3 areas within the Venn diagram? And those that do meet the 3 will be prioritized. So hopefully it avoids a waiting list.
Okay, thank you.
No, thanks, Bill. That's really good into the nuts and bolts and the logistics of it. It gives me an opportunity to try and explain it.
Yeah.
And, so I don't know which is the best system, but I know which of the systems we use. And but the system we use is part of the national implementation plan for Ireland, which we need a new one, because where we're at now is obviously just 2018 to 2021, November, so we're nearly there. And obviously COVID has an impact universally, internationally, so I don't know if it leads. But the whole idea now, in terms of it's really a pilot project, is to scale up and get the there's a number of research, evaluations, and audits going on, and to see where the gaps are, where do we need to redirect services on the health side, the housing side, on the OT side, on peer support elements that we could focus on more and build and scale up for the future, hopefully.
The multidisciplinary team, are they all in-house or are they external?
Yeah, good. Again, there's different contexts. In my context, they're internal, but they would have been seconded from the HSE, but they're working within the multidisciplinary team within the Housing First project on a day-to-day basis with the case managers and the clinical nurse managers, the occupational therapists and clinical psychologists. And so they're working together. Everybody works with each individual as such on their daily communication meetings, on care planning, on the operations and the service development. And there's a specific role for each client that our service president that are meeting daily. So it's very much intertwined and shared in that aspect. And of course, you have specific skill sets and specific areas of expertise from the case managers to a clinical nurse, but also there's very much of an aspect which is intrinsic in the pathways model of Housing First, is that that you kind of have to do a bit of everything, because if somebody requires something in their apartment, if they need that done or assisted, it doesn't really matter to them whether it comes from a case manager, a project worker, or an occupational
Right.
therapist. So it's that element as well of the shared care. Good questions, Bill.
Thank you.
Anybody else on the principles of Housing First? Okay, I'll move on a little bit more. It's kind of an extension of that. So people have power of choice and their life choices are honoured and upheld. Again, it's difficult if you see somebody deteriorating, overdosing, risk to life. It's a challenging area, but all you can do really is your expert knowledge, support, advise, pathways to supports, referrals, whatever it takes to reduce the risk and the harm. Housing First seeks to support client choice and client voice, not to change people to fit into existing programs. That's the beauty of Housing First, is we're in lots of expertise in the wider society in terms of medical expertise, but for whatever reason, our cohort or client group don't get to them or sustain visiting these supports. And by bringing it into our homes, it's adapted and modified to meet their needs. And obviously, ideally, the integration into the wider community. When communities introduce Housing First programs, the so-called hard-to-house, homeless by choice, or treatment-resistant clients generally show a dramatically different and a very positive response and engage with the Housing First program. Clients quickly grasp that this program respects that they have wishes and plans of their own, and it is not designed to demand that they must change. Rather, it is there to actually listen to them and support them in meeting their own self-defined needs. Internationally, the Housing First model is underpinned by the following ethos: housing as a basic human right. And some of the day-to-day stuff is really important as well, like a warmth, respect, which I know you're all familiar with, and compassion for our clients, a welcoming, and Denise pointed out, a trauma-informed culture, program culture, recovery-focused services, active engagement, and relationship building. Social inclusion using a scattered site housing model and separating housing from treatment, harm reduction. Clients have a choice to accept or reject any suggested services. However, they must meet their case manager in their apartment at least once a week, or more often if needed. Housing First staff must learn to balance the principle of consumer choice with assertive engagement. Practicing consumer choice is not a passive approach. Staff must find ways to remain actively engaged with their clients through good and bad times. Trauma and addiction are intimately related. We all know that. Housing First works within a harm reduction approach by providing access to housing for people who are actively using. The program acknowledges that alcohol and drug use are a normal part of human experience. suppose it is, but I suppose the difference between alcohol use and substance misuse. And the goal is to help clients to reduce use and to reduce destructive behaviours related to use. Also, Housing First is totally consistent with the abstinence model as well, the Minnesota model, AA, smart recovery, anything that reduces the harm. Some components of the harm reduction approach include healthcare, screening and intervention, needle exchange, education and counselling, opioid substitute treatment, and naloxone treatment. For many, exiting homelessness removes a major reason for abusing alcohol or drugs. Once safely and security are assured, which the housing provides, attention often shifts to thinking about what is needed to hold on to housing. Behaviours around drug and alcohol begin to change after the person is housed, not because it is required by the program, but because it matters to the person. That's crucially important. So harm reduction is simply a set of here and now practical strategies to help people minimize adverse effects and reduce the negative consequences of drug and alcohol use. Housing First workers take on a non-judgmental harm reduction approach to working with clients in active drug use. Workers may understand but do not condone or encourage the continued use of illegal or harmful substances. We mentioned that already. And it is intended to maintain open and honest communication and to support the client in protecting or improving their own safety and health and that of others. So we mentioned already the separation of housing and services, just to come briefly into that. So in Housing First, the principle of separating housing from treatment is evident at program admission. It's really important. Clients are not required to participate in the psychiatric treatment or obtain a period of abstinence to be housed. Treatment for mental health and substance misuse is a separate conversation to the discussion about selecting a home, moving in, and responsibilities of tenancy. Most housing services are provided in the client's natural environments, i.e., their home or local community. The service is time unlimited and that is offered for as long as the client needs that level of support. Again, we've covered this already. The Housing First program takes this recovery-focused, holistic approach by offering a decent and affordable place to live and then providing support services that aim not only to ameliorate symptoms, but also to reduce the negative impacts of the illness and assist clients achieve the maximum degree of recovery possible. It is important, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of fidelity, to operate Housing First correctly and to use these guidelines because high adherence to Housing First program fidelity delivers better outcomes for clients. So this is evidence-based. Housing First fidelity is a term commonly used to describe the extent to which particular service follows the principles of Housing First in its service delivery. For example, in order to address the diverse approaches used to implement Housing First in the USA, the pathways of the Housing National Organization developed a fidelity scale, we mentioned this earlier, to promote a consistency in implementing the Housing First model. So this effectively is quality control in that aspect. So the greater, I don't want to read through it all. I prefer to answer questions and discuss further before we go to section 4, which will be the conclusion. So going back to the learning outcomes, what is Housing First? Why Housing First? Who is it for? And does it work? So that's where we come on to next. Is there any questions on the last section? Any further questions? If not, we should be well within time. It's nearly 4 o'clock now. So we have one section to go. And so if it's okay with you, we can take a little break. Good. Talk to you in a minute. Thank you, guys. Hello, welcome back, everybody. We're at the concluding stage, and my voice is just about held up, I think. And I suppose it's really a recap and looking at what we covered today. And in that context, obviously, we looked at why housing, what is Housing First? Why Housing First? Who is it for? Who do we prioritize? And I suppose the section we want to cover, does Housing First work? It's an evidence-based, proven best practice model. It works, aligned with other approaches. It needs that. It needs the stakeholders involved. It needs the interagency wraparound supports and buy-in for all significant stakeholders. And then following that, we covered the staircase model and the housing first model. And we looked at fidelity and the importance of fidelity to a successful housing first approach. And then we went into the principles, the core principles of housing first, and the practices really, and the culture of housing first. So in this section, we're going to conclude, and we're going to look at some of evidence-based research as well. That has highlighted the successes of some of the models universally and in Europe and more locally as well. So the goal of the Housing First program is to prioritize and engage those who remained outside the existing service system by providing a different type of program. It is anticipated that some individuals would not fit the traditional clinical criteria for admission to mental health, addiction, or other services. There may be others who are reluctant to engage in treatment and require outreach and home visits to build trust ahead of providing treatment. So again, it's a cohort we're targeting. It's not everybody in the homeless services. It's the long-term homeless, rough sleepers, and service participants experience multiple needs exclusions around addiction, mental health, adverse child experiences, and many, many more. So with Housing First, success is defined by the program's ability to change to successfully meet the needs of the client. So as opposed to our macro systems, which are under massive pressure, we have to adapt both the case managers, the clinical teams, people like myself, to meet the needs of our clients, to be person-centered and tailored and self-directive. So this is a radical shift from expecting clients to conform to program rules to succeed. The National Implementation Plan in Ireland, for example, states that the priority target group for Housing First response are people with a history of sleeping rough and long-term users of emergency homeless accommodation with high and complex mental health and addiction needs. So again, with this recapping really, they're just examples here I won't go into now, but in the Irish context of the groups we just identified, the long-term homeless, high support needs, rough sleeping, and that's from the Irish National Implementation Plan 2018 to 2021, which I mentioned earlier. Again, I can send Matilda this document for those of you who don't have it, particularly across Europe, and the manual I mentioned earlier. So the more people get to see it, the better. So I'm reading to say again, this is similar to what I just mentioned. I will send these slides to yourselves if you want them as well, through Matilda. Again, it's just, I mentioned here the Venn diagram earlier. So the people in the context of our service participants who have long-term homeless from our local authority records, and in terms of bed nights or rough sleeping, those most frequent in presentations to emergency departments or psychiatric units, and the local expertise and knowledge from the homeless services in the region combined. And if anybody meets the three criteria, they will be prioritized and so on, depending on the number of housing stock that we have. And in some cases, it may only be two of the elements, but long-term homelessness is key to it for Housing First. That's the first priority. Does Housing First work? Yes, it does. And it's evidence-based and it's proven. And so Housing First is an internationally recognized permanent solution for people who sleep rough and long-term users of emergency accommodation with complex needs. The international evidence shows that the Housing First services need to be part of an integrated homeless strategy to be truly effective. I can't overemphasize the importance of that integrated approach. An NGO or a homeless agency working on its own, it's great to follow the principles. We did it for years, I suppose, without the statutory funding, in terms of prioritizing who we house next, in terms of acuity scores and vulnerability index scores, and housing them successfully somewhat, but without the wraparound supports, without the clinical supports, without the intensity, without the number of home visits. Home visits is a crucial theme to successful housing first models. But in some cases, unlike your traditional tenancy sustainment, my colleagues could visit somebody 3-4 times a day, just to ensure they're safe, and that could be about operational stuff, using a washing machine or a cooker, helping cleaning, shopping, budgeting.
Mark,
Yes.
Sorry, can I ask? When you say your colleague could visit somebody 3 or 4 times a day, what if they don't want that visit?
That's fine too. That's part of the choice, absolutely, and that does happen too. It's a good question. Our experience in the last 2 or 3 years has been that I'm not aware of, outside it maybe about 2 or 3% of who wouldn't engage with it. And I think it comes back to that original, at the genesis of the relationship, when a key worker or a case manager, along with a colleague, particularly from the clinical side, meets somebody for the first time to say, look, have a think about this. We have some properties, you've been identified, and we'll come back to you next week, whatever it might be, whether they're in an emergency accommodation or rough sleeping, and see what you think. Do you want to go any further with this, etc. And coming from that, it's really kind of that relationship or communication of what it's about. That it's not what they may have experienced before, that there's no expectations except the ones I outlined earlier or identified earlier, on rent, lease agreement, tenancy agreement, and key work. And with the element of choice around many aspects, choice about your personal life, and choice about hopefully where you have the capacity and resources around the type of housing it is, and the control and the self-directiveness nature of their care planning. All these things are discussed in detail in the 4 to 6 weeks prior to housing. Within this, and Deirdre kind of identified earlier, the strengths-based approach, the strengths-based questionnaires. We're looking at the best periods of their life, what they're good at, and happiness scales, along with the assessments. It builds up a relationship, hopefully, and trust before they move in. And so, in a sense, it predominantly, once that relationship is a healthy one, going back to the motivational interviewing, the person-centered approach, brief interventions, trauma-informed services and trauma-informed care. Ideally, and the communication skills, and that humanistic approach, which is evident across all services, really. But I mean, it's just focusing on that. You tend to have built a relationship with the colleagues, etc. A lot of the clinical staff like to get to meet the potential tenants as early as possible as well, around showing them the properties too, just because they don't necessarily want to be viewed as a clinical nurse or a clinical psychologist. It's just, I'm a person who can help, and albeit they're bringing your expertise and skills to it, but it wouldn't really be evident in a conversation with the tenant. It just helps to psychologically inform the staff, and also about medical needs, etc., and share that. So it tends to be that sort of culture and practice tends to be more successful in terms of people engaging and being more honest about their issues around drug use or where their mental health status might be. And so that's the experience and that's the evidence so far. But there is cases, without doubt, that there's very little engagement, and that is challenging.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Super. Thanks a lot. So, Housing First is an internationally recognized permanent solution for people who sleep rough and long-term users of emergency accommodation with complex needs. The international evidence shows that Housing First services need to be part of an integrated homeless strategy to be truly effective. The evidence for its effectiveness is stronger than any other intervention targeting rough sleepers. So this is focused on the rough sleepers or long-term homeless with complex needs. Housing First is delivering very positive housing outcomes for a group whose needs have not been met by mainstream homeless services. While flexibility is required to adapt the approach to local conditions, it is important to follow the main principles of Housing First and preserve fidelity to the original evidence-based models. Outcomes are achieved when the core principles are followed. And hopefully that answers your question a small bit as well. It's going to come back to that, the choice. and the person-centered, working with people for as long as they need to support the division between housing and support and treatment. Housing is a human right, and coming from that perspective, harm reduction, of course, and recovery orientated, it tends to put, I think, staff in a different position, and they might be in a different role prior to Housing First. And it's just expanding that, sharing that, and it's not seamless, it's not challenge free, far from it. And that intensity, as you mentioned earlier, in some cases, 3 visits, 4 visits. In most cases, I suppose, that might be dropping meds that they may not be able to manage themselves, or maybe get stolen from them, or maybe, maybe in reference to an acquired brain injury. So you have that sort of level of, so there may not be any resistance in that example to staff calling 3 or 4 times a day, but there'd be other reasons as well. There is strong international evidence on the effectiveness of Housing First. It has worked in cities. Look, we can name them off here, but there's many more: Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Glasgow, Helsinki, Lisbon, London, Paris, Vienna, New York, Vancouver. It's also been deployed in rural contexts across Canada and in Vermont in the USA. We're actually twinned with Vermont here in Cork in the context of Housing First, so they offer us a lot of advice and supports. In Vermont were established around the same time as Pathways. Some of the Vermont hierarchy would have worked with Sam Decembers and Pathways in New York, and so it's a great sharing of information, not just, obviously more importantly here in Europe and the context of Fianza and Housing First Europe Hub, but there's international evidence out there as well. But again, we can increase that. Ireland, I think, has been on a smaller scale in a pilot project as such, has been quite successful. I think that will prove to be the case. I think Darragh O'Brien, the housing minister, will scale up in terms of rebuilding Ireland and housing for all strategy, which is not much in that, but it's going in the right direction. In the United States, where it first originated, Housing First has contributed to a reduction in chronic homelessness. Many empirical studies have confirmed the effectiveness of the Housing First approach. In a 4-year study in the USA involving 255 homeless persons, those participating in Housing First programs had a tenancy sustainment rate of 75%, while those engaging in treatment first programs had a tenancy sustainment rate of 50%. And that's from Stefanikis Decembers. Again, that's great in a way, but it's not just about tenancy sustainment and exiting people from homeless, but all the other aspects you mentioned earlier in terms of qualitative and quality of life are more challenging to measure, but the research has been put in place, and it's anecdotal and we can see it, but it's producing that now as the key to really reinforce the success of Housing First. Housing First has been successfully included as part of integrated national strategies, likewise in Ireland, as I mentioned earlier, to address homelessness in Canada, France, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. Finland has been different to Pathways, but it's been a great success story. Integrated homelessness strategies based on extensive interagency collaboration, the deployment of homeless prevention strategies, and a number of different types of services for those who are homeless, which include Housing First as an essential component, are designed to meet the range of needs of single, in the context we mentioned that earlier, homeless people. Integrated strategies involving Housing First have been successful in reducing homelessness to very low levels, especially in the Nordic countries. So the integration, again, is the key. Without that integration, you can do, like I said, you can have the values, you can have the principles, and you can be loyal and the fidelity towards them. But without the integrated approach from the stakeholders, the statutory stakeholders, the health system, the local authorities, the municipalities, and providing the skill sets along with the skill sets of the NGOs, the homeless agencies, it's not going to be as effective as it can be, and it's really proven to be the case. I think there is thankfully buy-in there, and it's definitely enhanced and improved the quality of lives of the people that we work with in our regions, that's for sure, from an integrated approach. So France is undertaking one of the largest trials of Housing First in Europe. Some of you might be familiar with the Chizwa program piloted first in 4 cities: Lille, Paris, so Toulouse, Marseille, and this was driven nationally. The international inter-ministerial body responsible for the national homeless strategy, the Housing First model deployed closely resembled the pathways to housing model in the USA. That's the December's model. A total of 703 people who were homeless entered the Unchaise-Moi research program, with 353 in the Unchaise-Moi group and 350 in the control group using traditional homeless services. Participants on average were homeless for 8.5 years, of which the average time spent rough sleeping was 4.5 years. 79% had an addiction issue, and 100% had severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia and bipolar. 2 years into the program, 85% were still housed, principally in the private rented sector, and the length of hospital stays had reduced by 50%. So conclusions: the evidence for Housing First from program trials and evaluations carried out in North America, Europe, and Ireland may be summarized as follows. Housing First works for homeless people with complex needs, including people who sleep rough, long-term users of emergency homeless accommodation, people with high and complex needs around health, mental health, and addiction, people with repeated contact with the criminal justice system, one of the areas we're going into next in Ireland. Generally, 75% to 85% of Housing First tenants maintain sustained exits from homelessness. Housing First can contribute to improvements in health, mental health, addiction, and social integration, but this happens over longer periods of time and may not be measurable for all tenants. And we kind of touched on that. Questions? So in summary, we looked at what is Housing First? Why Housing First? Who do we prioritize? We looked at the background, the overview, the history, the context. We looked at the staircase model and the Housing First approach. We looked at the importance of fidelity to the model. We looked at the principles, the core principles of Housing First, some of its practice issues, which we can have training in all those nuances and day-to-day operational areas, including harm reduction and trauma-informed care. We looked at the culture of it, the embodiment, the essence of it, the approach, and basically we then looked at, again, concluded on what it is, why, who.
Hey, Mark, can I ask a question there? Sorry.
Yes, Bill.
Is there any areas on the Housing First service? Is there any areas where you can improve on or include?
Brilliant question, Bill. Again, and that's a very interesting, because in Cork, for example, areas we can definitely build on, for example, are peer support, people with lived experience. That's in the Irish context, or for us, because we're at the early stages, like we started in 2019 officially, and you go straight into implementation and designing programs and staffing and trying to house clients. It kind of comes at the back of it, where it should, peer support should really be part of the design, the implementation, the reviews, the audits. So that's kind of been left a bit. So it's definitely that element. I think what's also, we mentioned some of the areas on housing is a huge issue, stock, We mentioned some of the areas we'd like to go into, where Housing First is going into in terms of the criminal justice system, Housing First for youths, Housing First for disability, Housing First for people, women experiencing domestic violence. There's all those areas. I think a real challenge as well is the regional and rural context, where it's now Ireland is not big, but I mean in terms of the US has challenges there. Again, that's where smart technology comes into it a lot. Again, but going back to some of the complexities of some of our clients we mentioned earlier with acquired brain injuries, mobility, incontinence, smart technology like smartphones and tablets may not work. But I suppose when you're traveling long distances compared to working in cities, even in Ireland, is a challenge to have those wraparound supports, as you mentioned earlier, calling to somebody 3 times a day. If your next tenant or meeting is 30 kilometers away or 50, there are challenges. We need to look at that. Again, areas around 24-hour support, we're looking at Cork City, where we have, a wider, through Cork Simon, a wider range of services like the 24-hour emergency accommodation, evening team leaders, weekend team leaders, weekend staff who can link in with, we can identify and target who will be the most vulnerable clients in the evening, relay information, and likewise weekends. You don't really have the same support systems in rural areas. It's something that to build on in terms of relief panels. Again, it goes back to funding and stuff like that. So for me, I think the main challenges are where we can work on is developing supports in regional or rural areas, and housing stock is a challenge, and the areas I mentioned about which is happening in the criminal justice, people leaving the criminal justice system, housing first youth, which has already started, but the areas I see identified and then where it needs to happen is with people with disabilities and women or people, families experiencing domestic violence. I think there's key areas there. It needs to scale up across the board, universally, internationally. We've got the stats, we've got the evidence, we've got the best practice, we've got the empirical evidence, evidence-based research, and it needs to scale up to target. Again, it's complementary to what already exists, and but just to target and to fund this more staffing in these areas as well. While it might appear expensive on initial viewing of it in terms of increased staffing and numbers, would say, for example, your traditional tenancy support worker might work with 20, 25 people, where the average housing first is 7. But obviously the impact in a wider, which why a lot of governments like it or taking it on, is because the impact it has on the criminal justice system. Because vast majority, for example, anecdotally in our region, would have, since they joined us in first, massively reduced appearances in court. They attend court with colleagues, with staff, if they have, and they don't get incarcerated, which is quite expensive, a lot more than housing somebody really after a while, and they don't end up in hospitals for long terms or for emergency departments. That's what, it's factual, it's proven. So there's real cost benefits analysis there to it. So there's loads of areas I think it needs to build up internationally and nationally and regional. It needs to scale up and develop those relationships between the statutories and those stakeholders that matter, and specific areas around regional, rural, and those aspects, and housing stock would be the key ones for me, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Good question. Excuse me. My voice is just about hanging in there.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Sure.
And apologies if you've already answered this. I was a bit late coming. How do you get communities to buy into this? And where I'm coming from is, if I have an estate of 57 apartments, and you have a homeless person who is using drugs, and you're trying to house him under the Housing First, and that person under Housing First doesn't have to stop using drugs to be housed, and so we'll have maybe somebody coming selling drugs onto that estate. What about the impact on the community? So how do you get the community to buy into this?
Brilliant question, and we've learned the hard way at times as well. Again, it's really about a balancing act. But again, a lot of it comes back to information and training, and spreading, I suppose, what Housing First is about. I suppose some of the issues initially are societal issues. They're not exclusive to homelessness. Drug use and or drug misuse, and there could be lots of tenants in lots of respectable, areas around anywhere that there's drug use or drug misuse or alcohol misuse. So in a sense, it's not exclusive. But if there is, like most approved housing bodies, all of them, they want to house people and house them successfully, and so they understand, housing, but want to be able to manage it. So in a sense, I can speak from my own experiences. The types of housing, in some cases, doesn't work. It's very difficult to get, or to procure or buy or access one-bed properties. So sometimes we've ended up in residential communities, either with school-going children or elder retired people in a gated community, and where people are sharing the lifts, the communal areas, the front doors, and where it caused lots of problems. And trying to manage it wasn't easy. And in some cases, to move the service participant to a different location. So I do think there's certain types of units, if somebody is exhibiting issues like clearly, like, I mean, the problem actually wasn't the tenant themselves. It was like he had his substance issues. There was the people calling, as you mentioned, and if they couldn't get in over the gate, they were climbing over the gate, shall we say, or they were lying in the grass where kids were supposed to be playing, etc. So we had huge issues there, and we did move more than one client on more than one occasion until we got a tenant that wasn't transparent at all in those issues. So there's a lot of trial and error in that. I do think whenever we move, and I know it's the case, it's evidence based in the context, is that you have to build up relationships with the owner or the landlord straight away. And in many cases, the landlord or the approved housing body is once they trust the organisation that they're dealing with all these things as best as possibly can in a legal and responsible way. They're generally, they're happy for the NGO to deal with it if they do deal with it. Again, it's coming back to the location. It's not like you want to move somebody to an area because there's already similar issues that it isn't really noticed, and it's trying to balance that out. It doesn't always work. It's really challenging, but we've had a lot of approved housing bodies work with us, and we have successfully housed tenants with them, and over many years, and not without challenges though. And but it's about building the relationship. It's about building the communication with the landlord in advance. Obviously, there's confidentiality on certain issues, but in knowing about what is your system, what do you have in place? Do you have property management? Do you have housing officers? Do you have a tenancy management team leader? Do you have people doing health and safety checks? Do you have the care team in there on a regular basis? And how are you going to manage it? So in a sense, there's no clear, simple antidote to it. It's about managing it. The reality is, I suppose, the problems are there in the first place. Nothing to do with, I suppose, with housing first or homeless services. The issues of addiction and homelessness and mental health are quite transparent in the community. I suppose, and housing first is what it's trying to do, is trying to house and support these people. And without those supports, it can create, the issues can be quite bigger and manifest in bigger ways for the wider community. But I know when you're trying to manage that with other tenants, it can be challenging. I don't know if I answered any of that or some of it, but it is a protracted communication, educational kind of approach, and responsible responses to the issues. Sometimes you have to take people out, and sometimes you have to ask them to surrender to tenancy and move them elsewhere.
Sorry, Mark, I just wanted to add something to Eleanor, that Eleanor, if you want, the British organization Homeless Link, as well as the Canadian Homeless Hub, have drafted many, many documents about how to engage with landlords and how to convince landlords about doing housing first. And if you're interested, I can share them with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Great.
And look, I'm coming from as a tenant relations officer myself with Respond Housing. And I manage different estates, and this is really where I'm coming from. How, if I have 57 other tenants, how under GDPR I can't give any information of who I'm going to house, and it's quite difficult. And yet, as I said, if they see other drug users coming to this apartment, we'll call it, obviously they're in fear, and it's very challenging, as Mark just said. Your back is to the wall.
Absolutely, Eleanor.
Because you have a duty of care to those tenants already living there.
And you're right, and there lies the challenge, because you're somebody who would like to probably explore and give somebody the opportunity through Housing First a home, and yet you're possibly restricted by the obligations, data protection, and the wider community by the fact that you're trying to the duty of care to them as well. But as Matilda pointed out, there is lots of your experience is not unique, Eleanor. In that sense. So there's lots of international and local and regional evidence of how to best manage that. And yeah, maybe you're in an ideal position, Eleanor, before maybe you take on that to get that, I suppose, the evidence and the research of how to manage it best. But I do think it comes down to communication and relationships between the approved housing body and the Housing First team in terms of but it's not easy, and not every type of housing block or project is suitable for Housing First. And I've learned that myself in properties that we bought that didn't suit and that were challenging. Again, a lot of it was down to what was available, and trying to get one beds. But yes, if you get the opportunity to seek out Matilda's links and information that she might be able to disseminate to you, because it will be helpful. And so it's a common experience and occurrence, but can be managed, but not without difficulty.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark.
Thanks, Eleanor. Best off, great question. Is there anybody else or anything else that anybody would like to ask before we conclude?
Mark, just some people have been wondering if you could share your presentation with the participants. So if you could send it to me, and then I will make sure that everybody gets it.
Matilda, absolutely. I will send on the presentation. I will send on the national implementation plan I mentioned earlier, especially for our international outside of Ireland friends, and Sam DeSummers' a manual for Housing First in Ireland, which he produced earlier this year, and I will send them all on to you. No problem. You can share it. Anything else? It was great having your company. Delighted to be able to deliver it, the training today. Again, we kind of touched on lots of areas, but you could go into so many areas from what Bill mentioned, Eleanor, Deirdre, Denise, right across the board, Dima. They're all specific topics that we could explore for a day, training, etc. But it is an exciting movement to be involved in. It is evidence-based, and I'm not interested in anything that's not best practice or evidence-based. It might sound like there's a lot of risk involved, but there is belief in people, of course, and there is a lot of aspects that maybe not be used in traditional models, but it is all evidence-based. It is proven, it does work, it is challenging, it is difficult, but it's highly, highly rewarding. And it's for someone who's worked for quite a length of time in the education sphere and in the home sphere. It's a daily learning experience, and it makes it a bit more exciting, particularly questions from yourselves, people like yourselves, but working and really to be honest with you, to observe my colleagues from all aspects and skills and expertise and compassion and humanism and humor and all the rest, but to see people who believe in the Housing First and see how they apply it into practice is quite motivating. It's quite educational for me, and it's and to see the impact it has on people's lives, which I'm surprised in some cases, without being negative, I didn't think to be alive 10 years ago, 5 years ago, to see them integrating with their family or doing an education course or getting employment, and maybe not all giving up substances. They still have their coping mechanisms, but some have. But generally, it's a continued support. It's a really evidence-based, proving approach, but it's not workable on its own. It needs stakeholder involvement. It needs interagency approaches, and it's complementary really to what already is good out there in terms of housing, in terms of homeless services, in terms of medical agencies and support. It works together alongside it to target the most vulnerable long-term homeless rough sleepers and those with multiple needs, exclusions, about addiction and mental health. So unless there's any other further questions, I'm happy to say goodbye to you and to hopefully we meet again in a future date and maybe sometime in person as opposed to online. But I thank you very much for your contribution, your intelligence, sincerity, and time.